All right, good morning. Welcome to a 75-minute session on troubleshooting MDT 2010 Light Touch. My name is Johan. I'm a Microsoft MVP in setup and deployment, and I will be your host for the next hour plus here. As you can see, we have a Twitter feed for this session. I try to monitor it as the session goes along, so if you have any questions that you are sort of a bit afraid of to ask publicly by raising your hand and simply ask them, because that's okay too, feel free to send them to this alias, and I try to monitor it while I'm up here. Already got one, and that's how we can use central login in MDT, but I will come back to that one later. So I also have swags for really good questions. You might be the happy owner of a 4 gigabyte USB stick that also can drive your phone for an hour on power. It's a built-in battery. So this is what we are up against. Basically, we will go scenario by scenario, issue by issue, and figure out how we can troubleshoot things effectively in MDT. I love MDT. I've been working with the platform forever, it seems, but the Achilles heel is really troubleshooting. When things go wrong, that's when most people started to struggle with it. So hopefully I will shed some light on that during the day. Just some assumption here. I do assume that the people attending a 300-level session on troubleshooting have worked with the product a little bit and simply want to learn more. So, right, take it from there. So what to do when things go wrong? Well, if you get an error saying 8000, 4005, bam, something happened. So get that error code. What that really means to you is that whatever you were hoping for, you didn't get. The solution will tell you nothing about why that error happened, because that is not a real error message, that 4005 thing. It's just a message saying something went wrong. I don't know what, but you will have to dive into the log files to figure out why. So often, it's related to like access denied, but it might be 10 more things. So again, we have to dive into the log files. The log files in MDT, they are text files, right, but they are not really formatted to be read by Notepad. They are formatted to be read by utility from the config manager toolkit, Trace32, which actually works in 32-bit WinP as well, but not in 64-bit WinP. But you can run this tool on the server as well and review the log file that way. The logs can be difficult to find sometimes because they move around a bit. For the most of the deployment, they will be on the C drive in the mini-entity folder. But what happens if MDT fails really in the beginning of things? Where are the log files now? Before MDT created the partition on the drive. Close. Yes, sir. In the RAM, exactly. So they are on X:, mini-entity for a while. And then, as soon as the sequence create that partition on the drive and format it, the login will continue on the C drive. And the problem is, what if something happens? So the deployment start, you see the nice blue background, solution accelerators background, and then something happens and it reboots. Where are the log files now? They are gone. Out the door. So what you can do in that scenario, if you experience this, you start a deployment and directly just reboots. As soon as you see the blue background, hit F8. Then you get a command prompt. And that will give you two things. One, you can start to read the log files. Two, it will prevent the machine from rebooting. Right. So, and then when deployment is completed, by default, the log files are, most of them, are moved into Windows temp deployment logs. So that's where you find when the deployment is done, when you actually click the Finish button on the wizard. All right. So the main log file in MDT is bdd.log. It's a sort of a legacy to the previous versions of MDT. This log file contains small pieces of other log files. So every script in MDT has its own log files. Those log files are being aggregated into this master bdd.log file. But the point is, if you could see, you were starting the deployment, you selected your sequence, and it started to go, and you saw it was about to partitioning the drive, and then it failed for some reason. If you saw that it was actually failing during disk part, it's sometimes quicker just to open a disk part script directly and look at that log file. Because again, each script has its own log file. But you could also open bdd.log, navigate down to the disk part section in it, and troubleshoot it that way. It's just about finding the information more quickly. The sequence itself also have a log file, but we normally use that for troubleshooting applications only. That information in the SMSTS log file, not so useful during deployment of the operating system, but most for post-installation procedures. So in addition to the MDT log files, we have log files in WinPE. They will tell you, for example, why a network card driver didn't load, or a disk controller driver didn't load. And I will show you those in a minute here. Then we have Windows setup logs, and these are depending on what OS you are deploying. Because what MDT does, one of the actions in the sequence will kick off the setup, no matter what OS it is. So if it's XP, it will run WinNT32. If it's Windows 7, it will kick off setup. And those engines has their own log files. And if they fail, you need to turn into those log files and see why it happened. So XP, as you most likely know, has set up API.log. It's been around for a while now. And Windows 7 has a few different log files with regards to drivers. And the core setup log file in Windows 7 is the bottom one, or second from the bottom, setup.act.log file. So if setup fails, don't click OK in the setup error dialog box. Go into the log files and review why it happened. So let's start a deployment, and I have actually started a deployment already. Anyone seen this? I have. A few of you. This message is basically saying that, all right, let me just kick off Zoom it here. Had to be the greatest utility ever, at least when presenting. It allows me to do things like that. So a connection to the deployment share could not be made. Possible cause, network routing error or network configuration error. Why could this happen? Well, this is a boot image starting. That boot image is trying to connect to your deployment server. What component in the boot image specifies what server to connect to? Close. Bootstrap, INI. Or did you say that? Or did you say boot INI? It's bootstrap. So if I hit F8 to get a command prompt, I can go into the deploy scripts folder, and I can look at the bootstrap ini file. And as you can see, I did a typo in it. My server is really named MDT, but I typed MTD, and it couldn't find it. And in this case, I also, because I automated its setup fully, I supplied the credentials to connect to the server. Normally, you don't do that when going to production environment, but this is the bootstrap I use when creating reference images. And for that purpose, I think it's just fine to have it in there, because that ISO never leaves my lab, ever. So how could I troubleshoot issues like this? Well, of course, I can do an IP config and verify, did I get an IP address at all? Is my network driver loaded? In this case, obviously. I can try to ping the server either by the NetBIOS name or by the fully qualified domain name. I can try to do a net use up to the server to see if I can connect to the share manually. Because if you can't do this manually in here, trust me, MDT will never ever connect to that share again. So what if you do an IP config and you end up with blank? It really says Windows IP configuration only. It just shows you this, but nothing more. Yeah, network card driver is missing. So how can we troubleshoot that now? Exactly. The comment was drv load, and that's worth one of these. Try to catch? Awesome, one hand. Receiver? I was wondering. No spots at all right. If this one is blank, we can go to a machine with network, go to the vendor site, download a few of the NIC drivers they have, because sometimes they have more than one. So which driver are you supposed to use? The Windows 7 driver, because Windows PE is Windows 7, or a subset of Windows 7. So I download the drivers from the vendor, put them on a USB device. I go to the machine, inject the USB device, and then I use driver load one by one of the drivers, and I see by starting WP init which one actually loads the network. And when I figure out, all right, this driver was working, then I will go back to my deployment share, and I will inject the drivers in there. And I will show you that a bit later when we talk about how to add drivers for the boot images. But this is how we can quickly figure out that this driver is needed. I mentioned a log file before. In the Windows System32 folder, you have the WP init log file. And WP init is, of course, the component starting network in WinPE. So by opening this file, I can actually see that WP init spent apparently about almost 2 seconds installing the network components. And it was doing that for this specific device. This is the plug-and-play ID of a virtual machine adapter, in this case, network adapter. For a real hardware, it will be vendor ID and device ID in here. But you also will see what driver it actually tried to load. And that can also sometimes give you a clue to, all right, it's picking the wrong driver. Why? And then we can see if it actually were successful of installing that network driver. Spend about 3 seconds doing that. So if you can see it picks the wrong driver for some reason, how can we troubleshoot that? You added the driver, it's in there, the plug-and-play ID is right, but yet it failed to start. Well, Windows, as well as Windows PE, has ranking. It simply tries to figure out the best match. And to troubleshoot ranking issues, we can review another log file. And that log file is in the in folder, and that log file is setupapi.dev.log file. And in this log file, you will see all device drivers being installed. And by reviewing this file, you can sometimes find information about why it picked a certain driver. For example, this is the ranking score of a specific driver. And if this log file will show you one potential match, no problem. But if it finds multiple, which one will it use? Exactly, the lowest score. the lowest rank will win. And that's being retrieved from the driver itself. Different points in this score is coming from different points in the driver. Signature, features, how well it's matching your plug-and-play ID. So that's how we can verify that we have connection to the server, that we have a network card driver working, using driver load, looking at the log files. And then we also need another driver in the boot image. A bit later, we need that. We need a storage driver so that we actually can apply our image over the network to the drive. And by just starting this part and doing a list disk, we can quite easily verify that we can see the drive. Because if we can't see the drive using list disk, MDT can't either. And then we have to do about the same approach. We have to figure out the storage controller that we need and add it. In general, and luckily, we don't have to add that many drivers into the boot images. Because, again, it's based on Windows 7, and Windows 7 has a pretty good base set of drivers. So normally, you end up in adding, 7, 8, 9 drivers more, and then you're good. Don't add drivers that are already in there. If it's working, don't touch it. If you've been an IT pro for more than 4 seconds, you know that. So I will kill this process, and I will start on another boot media with an actually correct ISO. Mr. Audio guy, do you know if they put any water up front here somewhere? Should have, and hide it really well. You see WinP starting. You see it's changing the screen resolution from 800 to 1024, and it's doing that by calling an unattended XML file in the root and setting the screen resolution. So if you want to have another resolution in WinP, you can simply edit that file. So now you can see it's actually connected to the deployment share, and it's now giving me a selection of sequences. Wow, thank you, sir. That's a service. So I will select a sequence, and I will continue. And this wizard, of course, displays different components depending on your server configuration. But in this case, I only selected to see 2 of the panes. Simply what sequence and what to do with it. So now you can see it's partitioned in the drive. And as I said, if it's failing right here, I will dive into the disk part log. And if I don't know exactly in what part it did fail, I will dive into the BDD log, because that will have all the information. So now you can see the sequence is now injecting drivers, but this time not for the boot image. Now for the upcoming operating system, which has not yet been deployed. So if I'm looking on the C drive now, if I do a listing on my C colon drivers, you can see it's adding content now to this folder here. And now it stopped, because I told it to stop. This can be very effective in troubleshooting, for example, drivers. In this case, I wanted the sequence to pause after loading the drivers to my drive, so that I can quickly go in and troubleshoot that. So how did I add a pause? Quite easy. On my server, I wrote an amazing VB script This is hardcore development. This. So when I run it, it will give me this. But if I go to my sequence here, my build lab sequences, I have a few drivers demo. Here we go. I added this as a command line here. Directly after that action. So this can be really useful to have the sequence stop at a specific location, because now I can start and dive into the command prompt and do some troubleshooting right at this point. So how does MDT inject drivers for the operating systems? Well, for Windows 7 deployments, it's actually 3 different steps. First, the sequence will contact the driver repository, figure out, depending on your configuration, what drivers that are supposed to be needed for this machine. And then the CDI driver script will copy those drivers locally and put them in the C drivers folder. If that doesn't happen, if your driver is not copied, is there any point of troubleshooting further? No. Step 2 and 3 will never happen. Right. So that's something we do first, that we need to change our filters on the server, our driver group variable, our WMI filters, things like that. So the drivers are copied. Then later, we will see that setup, calling dism, another component, will actually stage these drivers into the driver store. Yes, sir? Yeah. It depends. You have about 3 different options in MDT of configuring how to work with drivers. One of the most commonly used options is to use exactly make and model. And that was a really good question. There we go. So the script copies the drivers. Setup will inject them into the driver store. And if that fails, we'll have to dive into the setup log file. Setup ACT.log file, CBS.log file, the component servicing, dism log file, which actually does the injection called by setup. And that's step number 2. Then, later on, Windows will reboot, go into mini setup, and the plug-and-play service will actually try to install the driver from the driver store. And if that fails, well, we have to review the same log file as I showed you in WinPE, setup.api.dev.log. So 3 steps: copy drivers, check that. Was it staged correctly? Check that. Were it actually installed? Check that. So compared with XP deployments, more things to check, but if you know the order, it's actually quite easy to troubleshoot. All right. So what about these log files? They are on the client. How easy do you think it is to have a branch office being deployed, 14 people working there, and a deployment fails, and then you're on the phone trying to convince them to hit F8, navigate and find the log files, do a net use somewhere, and copy the log files to you? Well, if it's an IT pro, probably not an issue at all, but if it's a normal end user, probably big-time issues. So what we can do in MDT is that we can enable server-side logging, which is not enabled by default, but it's pretty easy to add. Server-side logging, and that was basically to answer one of the questions in the forum here, or in the feed. Either in the workbench, you right-click your deployment share and go Properties. That's one option. Another option is to go directly into the custom settings on ini file, which is the same thing. The information you have in here, as most of you know, it's exactly what you have here. This is just the UI for Notepad. In here, you can see I have added 2 lines up here. These are server-side logging variables. This one will cause MDT, if a problem happens, if an error occurs, they will copy the log files to the server. And they will also copy the log files after a full deployment is completed successfully, which is cool. The second one is real-time logging. And as you can see, I'm configuring to create a folder for every individual computer I'm deploying. So if I go to my server now, dynamic logs, I should have a folder from this time frame. It's probably this one. Here I have my bdd.log file, and it's currently injecting drivers, right? So if I go back to my client, click OK on the pause, go back to my server, there is a new pause. You can see the log file is changing constantly. It's now running the setup. So you can actually see, and this will scroll as deployment goes by. So you can actually, on the server console, you can see the clients being deployed. Yes, sir? The question was, will it use the same permissions as the user being logged on to start deployment? Yes, it would. So in this case, build account, and build account would have to need to have permissions to write stuff into the logs folder. Yeah. Right. Have other few questions coming in. What's up with unable to edit unattended XML file on imported Vim files? That's normally an issue when you try to create catalog files for 32-bit operating systems on a 64-bit host. Can't do that. It's not supported, doesn't work. If you need to regenerate the catalog file for some reason, do that on a 32-bit system and copy the catalog file to the server. In general, you don't have to generate it. In Image Manager, just open the catalog file directly instead of the Vim. Find the unattended XML file in the control folder and open it that way. Who's asking the question? Over there. Yeah, excellent. Yep. All right. The question was, and that's totally worth one of these. Have one more, by the way. Thank you. The question was, how can I make sure that write drivers are being copied or considered to be injected later? Isn't it true that less is more? Yes, less is more. But it depends really on your environment. If your environment is that you have 3 hardware models, period, that's it, they are never going to change, well, we can just add in those drivers into the workbench and they will be injected based on plug-and-play ID, and that will work great for that scenario. If you have more than 3 models and maybe even possible multiple vendors, that's not going to work anymore. So now you need to create a more granular structure in the workbench and make sure only the correct drivers are being injected. And the way I recommend doing that is going by make and model and OS, or in rather OS, make model. So I'm only injecting drivers I actually need into the image. You may want to stage more drivers than you need. You may have like desktop computers, different models, but they may plug in a keyboard with a smart card device in it in the future. So it may make sense to have that driver being copied as well. Or you know that the users are using a web camera or a scanner or a phone or a printer. It's not connected during deployment time, but it will be later. So now you can have a folder to add in drivers for stuff you know they are going to add later, because that's the beauty of the Windows 7 driver store. As soon as you as an admin states the driver, it's now trusted. So a normal end user can actually install it. That did not happen in the XP days. You had to be an admin to install those devices. Yes, sir? So the question is, or two questions actually. Why is it that a WMI filter may fail, and why a second gather script would solve the problem? I haven't seen that exact issue, and I wouldn't say what the CDI gather does, it will collect all the variables and store them in memory and store them in a text file on the disk, so it will survive a reboot. And in those variables, for example, are the driver groups to copy and things like that, the folders to copy. If the WMI filter fails, you would probably have to check the SMSTS log file, because that will have the condition evaluates to true reason why or not. So often it's where you have like a typo somewhere in the WMI filter or things like that. So I would troubleshoot the SMSTS log file for that specific issue. That might be the case. To the follow-up comment, it could be due to replication issues, but yes, again, SMSTS log file will tell you why a specific condition or action did not happen. So you can see we are continuously getting more information. In this case, one more line was added saying this has been running now for 6 minutes, and eventually it will be 12, and eventually it will continue and do the rest things of the sequence. Let me see here. All right. Is Trace64 ever going to see the light in public? I don't know. There was a 64-bit version of Trace available for 3 weeks on Microsoft Download until they put it back. It was not properly tested yet and was not supposed to be released, and it just happened. If you are creative, you can probably find it. But I'm hoping that since Config Manager 2012 now is native 64-bit, I'm really hoping for that they will create a Config Manager 2012 Toolkit package, which also will have a 64-bit version of the Trace utility. The problem with Trace32 is that you cannot simply run it on a 64-bit WinPE, because Windows 64-bit WinPE does not have Windows on Windows 64. It cannot run 32-bit apps at all, like a normal Windows could. All right. Another question. Any way for MDT or WDS to pull computer name from AD like RIS? Yes, there is a web service you can use for that. It's not in the box, but if you go to Michael Niehaus' blog, you can download it. So if you search for RIS-style computer naming, you have it there. Question about boot image drivers. USB 3 drivers need to be added. Yes, they do. It's a storage driver. Like modern machines, like this 8540, does have 2 of its ports, USB 3. And in order for them to work during boot, if I have like a USB stick in them, I need to have the USB 3 drivers added as storage as well. So that's correct. All right. Let's continue with that. So I will just kill this client for now. We are not going to wait until this one is finished. And we'll jump back to the slides. So inside the MDT documentation, you actually have some, they are not fully updated, they are not, but they are close and good enough. They will show you the order of things when you do deployment with MDT. So let me just show you those real quick. If I switch to the demo laptop, it would help, I think. In the help file, if you go to the, troubleshooting reference, you will find flowcharts that will describe all the processes that happens during deployment and why and when. I actually had a customer printing these guys out on A3 paper and just painted their lab room with them to be able to quickly navigate and see where things were happening. You can also download a Word version of the help files. It's called an optional print-ready documentation download, so you can easily print them, because printing from a shim file, a compiled help file, don't do that. A lot of papers and weird formats. So these are really useful to understanding in what order things are happening. So what about the error codes we might get? Well, if we are lucky, we got decent error codes. 8007, meaning probably something related to network, because that's the first 4. And then the last 4 is the exact error. And that error is, of course, in hex. We convert it to decimal, and we can use the normal built-in functions either in Trace32 or in net help message to figure out and get this real error code behind this. So that can help as well. Now, what about our boot images? Because if it breaks, it normally breaks quite quickly. First of all, no matter what, you need ½ gig of RAM on the machine. WinP will not work otherwise. That's not a problem if you deploy Windows 7, because then you normally have more memory than that, but it could be an issue if you're deploying XP still and you only have like 256, then you can't use MDT, period, to deploy it. I talked about drivers into the boot image. Sometimes you run into these creative vendors that create drivers that are 2-tier. They have a pseudo driver and they have a real driver. I won't mention anybody by name, but Broadcom does this. So they have a driver for Windows, and then they have a special driver for WinP, because WinP simply doesn't get this 2-tier driver stuff. So on the vendor side, if you run into this, also NVIDIA used to do this in the past. They had an M-Force 4 NIC driver way back, same story. You need to find a monolithic version of that driver. And it's not always said to be monolithic. It will say driver for RIS, driver for WDS, driver for ADS, the old automated deployment services, driver for WinP. And that's the driver you need for the boot image. Then the third bullet here, I would say this is pretty common. You start a setup, and it fails because you had something wrong on the server. And then you go back to the server, you fix it, and you try the setup again. And it still fails. But everything now is correct. Problem is, the previous setup is now on the drive, and when you start the deployment again, MDT is trying to be smart and trying to recover it never, ever recovers. It just fails. So sometimes when you do repeated tests, it actually makes sense to clean the drive in between. And you don't actually need to clean the drive. It's actually 2 folders that needs to be deleted. That's the mini-empty folder, where we have the logs, but also the variables. And we have the underscore SMS task sequence folder that needs to be deleted. If you search for my last name, which is quite unique in terms of deployment, and leftover junk on internet, you will find an article that I'll show you how to configure the answer file in the boot image to always rename those folders if they exist, so it doesn't sort of stop because of junk on the drive. And I thought it was better to rename them than to actually just wipe the drive. Yes, sir? So the question was, what about having a VB script doing a disk part clean? You can absolutely do that as well. It's just that if you do have stuff on the drive that you sort of want to look at, yeah. Yes, sir, in the back. Oh, that's a totally good question. Because that's a bug. Sorry. I think I have insurance here from Microsoft. The question was, all right, leftover junk in the beginning, fine, it's easy to fix. What about stuff that is left over after deployment is done? MDT is supposed to clean up a few folders when it's done, and especially the mini-empty folder. But sometimes, and especially when we do offline deployments, deployment from media, that folder is still there. So to solve that problem in the past, I can probably use this one. All right. It took me there. A while back, I posted a small HTA that is being called by the script, which I start in the very end of the sequence. And I start it in such a way so a script starts this app or HTA, and then this HTA loops through and waits until the sequence is completed. And then it deletes the folders that the sequence could not delete. Because the problem with the sequence is that the folders are in use when the sequence is running. So therefore, it sometimes can't delete it. But this one does, because it waits until the sequence is finished. But in the default sample that I provide, I only wait for about 20 loops times, 5 seconds or 4 seconds, I don't remember, to wait for the sequence to kill or to die. But what if the sequence doesn't die? Can't do the cleanup. So sometimes you would be able to modify this to also actually kill the sequence or close the file handles to that folder, because often it's simply they are in use, therefore we cannot delete them. But this should be at least a step on the way, because this will solve like 99% of folder not being deleted issues. And I also do other things that I sort of think is useful. If a sysprep folder is present because sysprep failed, that will want to contain, admin password and clear text. Away with it. I don't want it. And by default, when we deploy in MDT, when the deployment is done, even if we join a domain, it still prompts you to log in to the local machine. If you join a machine into a domain, What's the likelihood that we immediately want to log on to the local workgroup machine account? Not very likely at all. So I just have a registry script setting the default domain name in the dialog box to whatever domain you actually joined in the setup. And I also enable Windows Update because MDT has a way of disabling that. I don't like that. All right. In the past, and if you were deploying Windows and not used MDT, you would run into, in some scenarios, when you deployed legacy OSs, it will actually convert your file system from NTFS into RAW. And this was called the Windows PE Überbug, and it was present starting back in 2006 when Vista came along. The bug is still in WinPE, but MDT has code to prevent this from happening. So they are now correcting the disk alignment that would cause this issue. So as long as you use MDT or Config Manager for that matter, they will fix this issue for you, so you don't have to worry about it. And in general, with WinPE issues, of course, always use the latest version, except for Service Pack 1 of Windows 7. I still recommend to use Windows PE 3 for Windows 7 SP1 deployment because that's the simplest way in the workbench to deal with it right now. The only reason you should need the 3.1 media is if you really need support for 8021X networks, 4K alignment disks like the new advanced format drives. Otherwise, you don't need it. You can simply keep using the same version as well. Yes, sir? So the question was, I'm using Dell. We are now getting announcements from Dell saying that every machine that we buy from them will have the new AF format drives delivering to them. Do you recommend using WinPE 3.1? Well, you need to get that hotfix in somehow. So either you download a hotfix for it and inject it, or you use WinPE 3.1 for that specific scenario, or for those machines. If you do, there is a good article by Mr. Niehaus on that topic. I have to spell it right. I think this is the one. No, this is the one. Because if you do add in version 3.1 of the boot image into the workbench and update the Wike Media Windows Ike version, you will run into strange issues when it tries to update that deployment share. So it will try to pull updated media from your boot images that you add rather than from Wike itself. By doing a simple change in the settings XML file in the workbench, you can cause it not to pull it from the boot images directly, but rather use it from the right source. So if you do start adding 3.1 images because you need to for hardware-specific reasons, pay attention to this article. Yep, it's a good one. All right. So back to demo. How can we fix our WinPE issues? Very easy. In your deployment share, I recommend you guys to create 2 folders in out-of-box drivers. Name them WinP 32-bit and WinP 64-bit, and import, of course, the right drivers to the right folder. But only add in drivers that you want for the boot image in these folders. So only like the monolithic version, only the NIC and storage drivers needed, and things like that. So you normally have maybe a few drivers in here. I don't have too many, but a few, an Intel and a few VMware NICs here. All right. Then you create a selection profile. That's a filter. And that filter is normally named about the same thing. So I have a WinP filter here, selecting that folder, right? And I have a 64-bit filter, selecting the 64-bit folder. So it's just right-clicking and select and create new filter or new selection profile. Then, on my deployment share properties, on the WinP Components tab, this is my 32-bit component tab. I'm configuring it to use that profile. And I'm also selecting to include all drivers from that profile. What I'm basically doing, because I created a folder, and because I created a filter with that folder selected, and now I'm configuring the workbench to use that folder, it will only inject the drivers in that specific folder. So, and this allows me to have less junk in my boot image. If your boot image is 300 megs in size, something is terribly wrong. It shouldn't be that big. And the same thing for 64-bit components. Select the filter, check the drivers box, and you should be good. A similar problem is now, all right, so we did all that. We added the right drivers. We created the filter like Johan said, and we started deployment, and later, we can't inject the right drivers into Windows. And when we start troubleshooting, we realize, all right, it's the fault of the boot image. Do you have any idea what could be the cause here? It turns out that when Windows, setup calling dism is injecting the driver, it's actually staging them somewhere. And somewhere in this case is in RAM. And the RAM buffer is 32 megs in size. And the NVIDIA graphics driver is bigger than that. It's about 80. You don't have to go to high school, university, college to realize it's difficult to fit an 80 meg driver into a 32 meg buffer. So what do? We increase the buffer. The buffer is named scratch space. So in the WinP component settings, you drill down here, you make sure to set the scratch space to at least 128. Maximum is 512. I don't recommend to set it to more, because I still want my boot image to work on half-gig memory machines. But if you are only deploying Windows 7, and you always have like a gig or more in the machine, go ahead, crank it up. It doesn't do any difference. But I have not yet seen a driver needing more than 128. On the other hand, I haven't seen the June release of that driver either. So, and the same thing for 64-bit. You set the scratch space. And this is something you would do to the deployment share you are using for production. That's really it. So, what about Pixie? Well, turns out we want Pixie. So we are trying to talk the network group into using Pixie so that we don't have to run around with a CD or a USB stick that it's constantly getting the wrong version, missing the right driver, things like that. If we do have our Pixie server and DHCP on the same box, we are good. But we need to configure it correctly to be allowing them to be on the same box, because otherwise they will compete on using the same ports. This is quite difficult to miss, because if you deploy DHCP first and then install WDDS, which is the Pixie, it will actually prompt you and say, hey, don't you want to select these two options? Yes, you do. And you click and continue. But this is something you need to do. What if you're having DHCP and Pixie not only on different servers, but on different subnets, different VLANs? Then you need to configure, or have the networking group configure, IP helpers, so that the clients on that VLAN will know what Pixie server or DHCP server to connect to and use. I know that you can use DHCP and set scope options and things like that as well. That's less reliable. IP helper is simply your first choice, because that's the quickest and most reliable way of dealing with multiple VLANs. You will even find hardware failing on you. Can't do Pixie at all because they don't support the tags or the options coming from the DHCP server. So IP helpers is much more reliable. A few other things you should be aware of with regards to Pixie boot. Let me go to my deployment services console here. I do recommend you guys to run this stuff on 2008 or beyond, because if you do, you don't only get a better Pixie server, you also get multicast support and you get SMB2 support. And multicast won't exactly give you speed, but it will give you efficiency over the network. SMB2 will give you speed, because it's about twice as fast copying things over the network on a LAN. But what if you decide to, for some odd reason, run DNS on the same machine as WDFs? You know, you have a small network or you have a branch office where you did this. Now they will start to claim the same ports. And the issue is that the deployment might work for 4 months, and then you restart the Pixie server for some reason or service, and suddenly things start to fail. And you did nothing. You just restarted the service. It turns out that these components are trying to claim the same dynamic range of ports. And the more clients you have, the more clients you deploy, the larger that range has to be. So we have two options here. If you are lucky of running Server 2008 R2, there is actually a bit we can flip in the registry. Not that one. This guy, UDP port policy, set it to 0. Now, Pixie will actually ask for a port rather than claim a port. The obvious workaround is, of course, don't use DNS on the same machine as Pixie. DNS belongs with another server role. DNS belongs with the domain controller, yeah. For security reasons, we want to have it on the domain controller, and then we don't have to worry about this. But if you run it like a small business server, a small network, or again, a branch office, we might need to set this. But this only works in 2008 R2. What if you are using 2003 and 2008? Well, back to the network tab on my properties, increase this range. Change this to, say, 50,000. So you have a span of 15,000 ports. So, and again, the more clients, the larger range. But this is what you have to do if running on the same box. I just want to give you a bit of a warning on multicast. It's a good thing. It's really difficult to enable in MDT because you need to find the properties on your deployment share, and you need to check this box here. This is how you enable it. But what happens if you start to do multicast deployment without talking to your network guys or without them knowing you are about to do multicast deployments? fun things can happen. I was talking with one customer who they just enabled multicast, and suddenly all their wireless network access points just died. Because the network were designed to have every single access point on the same VLAN as the clients. And it turned out these access points did not like the multicast protocol at all. So the network needs to be designed for multicast. Phones, for example. Some phones, they pixie boot. IP phones. And a normal IP phone really don't like to have a WinP version 3 boot image being downloaded to them for deployment. That's not how these guys work. So the question was, is there any dependency on IPv6 here? No, it's not. You don't need to have that enabled in one way, in any way. It doesn't. So this is still using good old protocols, for that matter. All right. So what about we do the deployment, we now have figured out the drivers for the boot image, we can do pixie booting, we have drivers being injected, and we know how to troubleshoot the sequence. Then we deploy the machine, it fails to join the domain, has nothing to do with the sequence, whatever. How do we troubleshoot it? Well, first of all, most join domain related issues are as simple as missing permissions in Active Directory. The account that you are using simply can't add machines into the OU you are trying to add the machine into. The best way of troubleshooting this, and this is since the XP days, review the net setup log file. So let me show show you an example of that. That log file this is from a failing join domain. You can see it was trying to use this account to join. It was connecting to this specific domain controller, trying to figure out if the machine existed. Eventually, it couldn't. And in the very end, it failed with an error code that we now can troubleshoot and review. And you see, it tried this multiple times. This could be simple things like network name resolution being wrong, missing permission, etc. If you get the wrong password for the join account, you will get like a 1326 message code in here. So if you take that one, you go into net help message and type in the error code. All right, wrong password. And then you know that. Don't forget to convert them into decimal, though. Or from a working one. Let me see. Where did I put you, my friend? There we go. I know I had it somewhere. This is an example of a machine joining a normal work group. Let me go to a machine that actually joined the domain. Windows, debug, net setup log, open up in Notepad. Clear information. It tried to join this machine into that specific OU using that specific account. And later, we got the code, access code, meaning good. So if you go to Active Directory, what are the permissions that we need to have a machine being joined to the domain? If I want to join machines into this OU, what permissions do I need to add for that account? The comment is, the standard user is allowed to add a few machines, 10. So if you only want to add a few, that's OK. If it's a domain admin, of course, it will always work. Don't configure your join account to be a domain admin. Yes, sir? The comment was add the computer account to give information or permission into this OU. That would be the correct answer if we were doing Pixie-based deployments using VDS. But now we are only using Pixie to start the boot image, and then MDT and the normal Windows setup will actually join the domain later. So it doesn't create the account at this point in time. But you're right in the one way, because we need two different permissions here. We need permissions to, if I have a new machine, I need permissions to create new computer accounts in that OU. But what if I'm refreshing this box? I'm doing a reinstallation of it. And I'm keeping the same name, which is thus by default. Now, creating permissions is not enough. I also need permissions to update the existing account in AD. So let me show you real quick what permissions that are sort of a foolproof configuration here. So you can do this through delegation. I prefer to do it directly through the security node, because that allows me to be a bit more granular when adding permissions. So I will go to Advanced, and I will add the join account I'm having, and I will give that account, normally I give it create, and I normally, even though it's not required, permissions to delete computer objects, because I normally have this service account also for management. But that's up to you. But I do need permissions to create, right? The comment was, what about adding a group? Absolutely a good idea. And then have this specific user member of that group. And this is, yeah, absolutely. And this is very useful, especially if you have environments where you're using different join domain accounts for different departments, sites, things like that. That's a really good comment. So either a group where the user is a member or adding the user in here. But these are the permissions that I normally add to be able to create and delete computer accounts in that OU. And now you need to really click OK before we can do the second set of permissions. Because the second set would be the permissions required to update information on existing computer objects, again, in a refresh scenario. So now I'm selecting, I only want to do permissions on computer objects, descendant computer objects. So I normally add in read and write for all the properties, read and modify the permissions, because even computer accounts has permissions. I set change and reset password, and I add the two in the bottom here. These are the SBN and the DNS hostname attributes. And this combination of 8 permissions is the minimal permissions that you need to be able to do about everything with a computer object in AD, with terms at least of deployment. And luckily, they are recording these sessions, so if you want, you can go back and review this list. But this is how you add permissions to them. Yeah. All right, so the question is, I'm having a distributed environment. I'm replicating my deployment share using DFS to different sites. How do I make sure my bootstrap ini file is connecting to the correct deployment share? First of all, WinP doesn't really get this with Active Directory sites. So I normally base it on IP subnet. So either I have a web service querying Active Directory about what site I'm in, and then connecting it directly to a specific server. Or if I don't have too many subnets, I may have only 10, I just add them in directly into Bootstrap ini, saying basically, let me show you. But not on my domain controller. Where did you go, my friend? Here we go. I would add in default gateway here. And I would take that variable, but not in custom settings in. I will do this in Bootstrap ini. Let me do this in here instead. I would do something like this, making sure, depending on subnet, it's now connected to the right server. But you can certainly, if you have a large environment, go ahead, download the web service from Codeplex. That will figure out the 80 site and connect depending on that. So I have to wait with more questions so I can go over the last pieces of the setup here. I would like to highlight, we talked about the plug-and-play detection method, which is the default. But for large environments, I do recommend to take advantage of filters and driver groups inside MDT to make driver injection happen more clearly. And also, sometimes when you try to deploy applications to this mechanism, when you download them over the internet, they are being put into a zone, so they're being protected. When you right-click them, you have to go unblock before you can actually deploy that application. So I'm not going to show you how to unblock an application, but I would like to highlight the streams utility from sysinternals, because it can traverse through a folder and unblock all the files in that folder, causing the application to work. So final piece, some customers, they use the database to connect to MDT and have the configuration stored inside the database. And often, light touch customers, they use SQL Express. And when we're using SQL Express, it's really useful to create a test environment so we can simulate the deployment without actually having to do a full deployment. And we can also use this to test an environment. So what you can simply do, you can go to a client on your network, copy a few files to a folder. And by the way, this slide deck is also downloaded from Comnet. And then you create a small batch file that simply runs the gather script. So now it will read through all the rules and do a full simulation of your deployment in 3 seconds rather than 30 minutes. And this is really useful to get the timing down when doing network issues. and database issues, rule settings, things like that. By that, ladies and gentlemen, my time is up for today. I will be here if you have more questions. Don't forget the evals, please, and as always, honest and gentle, but gentle, and thank you.